So here we have The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Tennyson, which is, as you can see, a slightly longer poem than most. Not that that matters, but there is significance in the length of this poem, in that it tells a story. So it needs a kind of narrative development, which other poems do not need. So it's worth bearing in mind. We'll come back to that later. The Charge of the Light Brigade is a reference to a mistake during the Crimean War, when a general sent the Light Brigade, which was a brigade of men on horses, carrying only sabres and light weaponry, to attack the enemy, who all had guns and cannons. So it's pretty clear to know how that ended up. So it was a misunderstanding, really, and this poem isn't really a criticism, although it does contain criticism of that decision, briefly. It's more a remembrance of heroism. So it is unlike some of the other poems. It isn't simply looking at conflict from the point of view of the terrible cost to human life, etc. It's looking at how people sacrifice themselves for something they believe in, which is different to some of the other poems. These three words scribbled here really sum up the themes, the tone of the poem throughout. There's a tone of admiration, which we'll look at in a minute, the language that demonstrates that. There's a tone of disbelief and a tone of horror, and all three are exemplified through language. So the structure of the poem, the form of the poem even, is a kind of ballad. It's not strictly a ballad because it doesn't. The number of lines changes and the rhythm changes, but it's a narrative poem more than anything. It's highly rhythmic, and it's written in the third person. It's distant. Tennyson wasn't there. He read about it via the Times newspaper, so he's writing something from a distance, retrospectively. Because of that, he's able to impose these three feelings of admiration, disbelief, and horror. And those three things can be seen straight away in the first couple of stanzas. Just the phrase, the valley of death, is highly emotive. It leaves nothing to the imagination. We get an idea of the quantity, 600. And also here, importantly, the idea that they were ordered, that it was an instruction. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. So the implication is of disbelief here, that the general in charge knew they were going towards guns, but he ordered it anyway. And then a repetition of Into the Valley of Death, rode the 600. And we get an awful lot of repetition, because Tennyson is emphasising what these men did, these 600 men had to do. Then in the next stanza, was there a man dismayed? A perfectly logical question. Charge for the guns. Was there a man dismayed? The answer is no, which is emphasised here. Theirs not to make reply. Theirs not to reason why. Theirs but to do and die. In other words, they're following orders. They are professional soldiers. Nobody tricked them. Nobody conned them. They weren't, going to work in a tower and somebody flew a plane into them. They were perfectly aware of the consequences of their profession. But he emphasises the bravery by juxtaposing that repetitive phrase, into the valley of death, next to that mantra of theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die into the valley of death, which is important because he wants us to admire these men as well as appreciate the horror of their death and his disbelief at the order. And then we have just further emphasis of the horror, really, of the situation. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them. You know, they are careering, they are charging on their horses into hell, which is emphasised here. The mouth of hell, the jaws of death. You know, these metaphors are very emotive and they're very obvious, and they also illustrate the position of these guns. It is like they are going to be consumed by these guns, to be eaten alive. We also have some brilliant use of verbs here: volleyed, thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Boldly they rode and well into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. I'll come back to these phrases later for a biblical reference to further emphasise their bravery and Tennyson's admiration for them. And a further examples of brilliant verb use here in this stanza. Sabring the gunners there. Just get the pen. Sabring the gunners there. Charging an army while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery's smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from their sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. So the verbs are incredibly important in all language, and they are under-analysed in poetry analysis. People are so obsessed with trying to analyse rhyme, trying to spot techniques. You know, the fact is the verbs tell you everything you need to know, and these verbs demonstrate the bravery of these men, sabring the gunners there, charging, plunged, they broke through, and they're used deliberately to exaggerate the bravery. There's also a sense of the enemy here, the Cossack and Russian, which he doesn't focus on too much because this is about honouring the Light Brigade. But just throwing that line in this stanza, it gives the audience a sense of confrontation, a sense that there is an enemy, that they died for a reason, that the Cossacks and the Russians, you know, are the people who we should be really angry with. But, and again, he hasn't really mentioned here the order again. That's by the by. This is about admiring the noble 600. Right. And the fact that it wasn't the 600 that rode back is an implicit mention of how many died. But he doesn't go into detail about that because that would be too negative. And he doesn't want to be negative.
It doesn't seem.
And again, we have a repetition of this phrase here, several lines. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them. So it's slightly changed. It's no longer in front, it's behind. They've broke through the lines, but now they're really trapped. They've got to get back through that line to get to safety. We have further repetition of the verbs, volleyed and thundered. Again, just to emphasise the sound of this battle, the nature of it, that tried to get some understanding of the experienced. And then you get the alliteration here, the sibilant, stormed out with shot and shell, which you could say, if you wanted to, that the sibilant S's here imitate the sound of bullets and things flying past their ears. While horse and hero fell, they that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell. All that was left of them, left of 600. So there's a real emphasis of those who survived and how brave and awesome they are. And poetically, you know, you can go through and find an awful lot of alliteration. The rhythm is very, It's very clear. It mimics, the rhythm mimics the running of the horse, if you like. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. It's purposeful. It's done on purpose. And those things are fairly obvious to talk about and write about, but the language analysis that you need can be found through the use of verbs, the use of adjectives, some of this alliteration as well. And then we finish with this shorter stanza, the 6th stanza, which some people say is 6 stanzas, represents 600 men. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't think that you'd ever mention that in your exam. And it starts with a question: when can their glory fade? Now that's a strange question. Does he want the glory to fade, or doesn't he want the glory to fade? Perhaps he's saying it should never fade. You know, we're very familiar with remembrance, with poppies, and how we honour those who gave their lives. This perhaps wasn't a tradition in the 19th century. Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made. Honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. And we have here these commands. Honour and honour. Now, this is not a negative poem like Flag, or Next of Course, God America I, or even the chaos and confusion of Bayonet Charge. This isn't necessarily a patriotic poem, but it's a poem about doing your duty. So it is patriotic, but it's not overtly flying the flag. It's honouring human achievement in the face of awful, awful conditions. So we have Valley of Death here. We have Jaws of Death and the Mouth of Hell. Both of these are references to that psalm, to the biblical. It's a biblical reference, and this is if you like, this is quite a biblical event. It's a battle that could quite easily have been in the Old Testament, and it's written in that kind of narrative form that you would find in the Psalms or in the Old Testament, and it's meant to be epic in its nature. It's meant to emphasise the heroism, whilst giving us a glimpse of the horror of the event. An excellent poem to compare this to, if you get the chance, is Poppies, because of the consequences of war. In terms of patriotism, as I've mentioned, you've got Bayonet Charge, Flag, Next of Course, God America I, and a whole host of others really, but it all depends on the question that's asked, obviously, which poem you compare it to. Something else important to mention here is Psalm 23, which starts like this: even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So this is a clear, this is echoed clearly in the poem, The Valley of the Shadow of Death, and it's something that most readers would have been familiar with. This biblical reference from the Psalms would have been something that Tennyson's audience readers would have been able to grasp. They would have seen the significance of the following phrases. And just to fill in the gap, this should have been earlier in the video. This is Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. This is from the Old Testament, and this is something that is echoed in the poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. The shadow of death, the valley of death, it's there. It's used purposefully. It's used to add gravitas to the poem. It's used to remind the audience, Tennyson's audience, that what they did was epic in its nature, and that what they did was noble. Fear no evil, for you are with me. It gives them a sense of righteousness, which isn't necessarily a truth, but it's something that rhetorically works for Tennyson and the message he wants to convey.